The year was 1868, and Arkansas was still reeling from the devastating scars left by the Civil War. Across its pine woods and swampy lowlands, whispers circulated of blood, betrayal, and families torn apart not only by politics, but by darker, more private feuds. And yet, no tale resonated with deeper unease than that of the Whitlock clan, a family whose very name seemed to carry with it the stench of dread. The Whitlocks were not rulers. They were not politicians nor commanders. They were landowners, common though firmly rooted in the wilderness they called home. People in neighboring towns often lowered their voices when speaking of them, as if uttering their name aloud was an invitation for misfortune. It wasn't just wealth disputes or neighborly grudges that shadowed the family, but something colder, something older, a history marked not by fortune but by horror. The Whitlock homestead stood in the outskirts of Drew County, far from the routes of traders and the tenuous roads that linked settlements across Arkansas. The land appeared normal enough, rough fields of cotton stretching against the horizon, the echo of cicadas in the summer haze, and a house standing large but stern, its weathered boards creaking under a sun that burned unforgivingly. Yet travelers swore that something about that place always felt wrong. Passing by the Whitlock property meant quickening one's pace, avoiding a glance toward the windows, and praying to leave the land behind before dusk crept over the tree line. Strangers may have dismissed these as nothing more than rural gossip, but those who lived near Drew County knew otherwise. There were events that could not be explained, family quarrels that ended not in reconciliation, but in graves, fires that broke out without reason, a cycle of tragedies that seemed to curse anyone carrying the Whitlock name. And it is here, in the smoldering years of Reconstruction America, where the disturbing history begins, not with a single bloody act, but with the slow unraveling of a family bound together by silence, anger, and secrets too heavy to bear. It is said that horror does not appear overnight. It grows breath by slow breath, festering in places nobody dares to confront. The Whitlocks carried that horror in their bloodline, a legacy no one understood but everyone feared. At the head of the clan was Silas Whitlock, a man hardened by war and by the land itself. His hands were thick with calluses, his eyes hollow with a kind of faithless determination. Silas believed in survival, nothing more. He had fought for the Confederacy, returned to his farm with no fortune, and instead of rebuilding, he seemed to tighten his grip on those around him. To his wife Martha and to his children he was an unyielding presence, one that demanded loyalty, silence, and obedience above all. Martha Whitlock was different. Before the war, she had been the daughter of a modest preacher, raised in towns where hymns filled wooden chapels and community-bound people together. But living under Silas's rule, her once bright spirit dimmed. By 1868, she appeared as a shadow of the woman she had once been, silent, watchful, whispering prayers in the dark when she thought no one could hear. The children, their names lost across generations except in fragments of courthouse records and yellowing newspaper clippings, were 3 sons and 2 daughters. Each bore the weight of growing up in a place where fear traveled more freely than tenderness. Discipline was harsh, affection scarcer still. And yet beneath it all they were bound by something unspoken, some acknowledgement that the Whitlock clan was not quite like others. Even the children seemed marked, set apart, as though caught in a legacy written long before their births. Neighbors often reported strange quarrels breaking out along the Whitlock fence line. Silas was notorious for feuding bitterly with those around him, whether over a disputed boundary, a borrowed mule that was never returned, or accusations of theft. But the violence of these conflicts ran deeper than a simple disagreement between farmers. More than once, violence spilled red across the soil, drawing the attention of sheriffs and judges who never seemed able or willing to fully intervene. What frightened the people most was not Silas's temper nor his disputes. It was the pattern. Misfortune hovered over the family, repeating itself with a kind of grim determination. Livestock would die suddenly and without explanation. Children would vanish into the wooded swamps for days, only to return with hollow eyes and silence on their lips. A barn would collapse despite being sturdily built. A baby would be born only to wither before its first breath became strong. The people could not describe it, but they felt it. The Whitlocks were touched by something unnatural. Arkansas was a land of faith in those days, where sermons rang on Sundays, and communities clung to Scripture as hope against brutality and famine. But even ministers hesitated in their judgment of the Whitlocks. No priest could cure their curses, no prayer would ease their griefs, and word spread that perhaps it was not the land that was cursed, but the blood in their veins. By 1868, the tragedy had reached a point where whispers became louder. People didn't speak of them merely as unlucky, but as dangerous. By then, locals could date at least 4 deaths to violent encounters involving the Whitlocks, and one such death, occurring in the bitter heat of that summer, would set the clan upon a downward spiral from which they could never truly return. On a July evening when cicadas shrilled in the heavy dusk, a neighbor named Elias Tully, a farmer known for his drinking and his own foul temper, came to the Whitlock property. He never returned home. What happened that night has been recounted in fragments, in sworn testimonies that contradicted one another, and in the fading memories of rural historians. Some say Silas shot him on the fence line after Elias accused the Whitlocks of stealing hogs. Others say Martha was the one who struck Elias down, tired of watching men spew words of contempt at her family. Still others believed all the Whitlocks had a hand in his fate, each member covering for the other as silence swallowed truth. Elias's body was found 3 days later, rotting in the edge of a swamp, and the Whitlocks were the last to have seen him alive. Yet when brought before justice, the family survived somehow. Witnesses recanted, evidence mysteriously disappeared, and when the jury spoke, no guilt was laid on the Whitlocks. For the town, this was not relief. It was confirmation of a darker truth. The Whitlocks weren't just cursed, they were untouchable. This was the moment when the clan's fate took its truest, most dreadful form. For every year that followed, whispers became stories, and stories hardened into legend. To say the Whitlocks were dangerous became common tongue. To call their name was to invite death. And what came in the following years would not only confirm the rumors but cement the Whitlocks as one of the darkest family legacies in Arkansas history. What began with blood on a fence line would spiral into horror within the walls of their own home. After the death of Elias Tully, the Whitlock farm became more than just a place on a map. It became a boundary in people's minds, a place where daylight seemed shorter and the nights carried weight. Farmers who once shared tools or walked past on errands began to reroute their paths. Mothers warned children to never stray near the Whitlock fence line, and yet what unsettled them all the most was the silence. The Whitlocks themselves said little, holding their composure as if nothing had happened. In the weeks following Elias's burial, neighbors noted a strange stillness around the property. No more arguments over land, no more shouts from Silas echoing across the fields. It was as if the household had been swallowed whole by its own secrecy. Inside the Whitlock home, however, the silence was deceptive. Martha Whitlock moved quietly, her prayers whispered not with hope but with urgency. She feared what her children were growing up to become, reflections of Silas, shadows hardened by his coldness. The eldest son, Thomas, had begun mimicking his father's stern gaze. He walked with a defiance uncommon in boys of only 16. Elias's death had marked him. Anyone watching could see it. He carried the memory not like a burden but like a lesson. He had seen what survival meant in the Whitlock house. Make no mistake, show no weakness, bury all mercy. The younger sons were not far behind. James, barely 14, lingered with questions no one dared answer. His notebooks, scraps of papers saved from a former tutor, showed sketches of the swamp, careful renderings of dead animals, notes scribbled in angry strokes. Elias's death haunted him differently, not as a badge of pride but as a puzzle he could never solve aloud. The daughters, Mary and Ruth, should have fared differently. Girls in 1868 Arkansas were expected to learn sewing, cooking, and the tender graces of keeping a household. And yet, growing in the Whitlock home, tenderness rarely survived. Mary, the elder, was sharp with her words, unflinching in her silence. Ruth, the youngest of all, barely 10, carried eyes far older than her years, as though she had absorbed grief before ever learning innocence. Rumors in the town grew with every month. Whispers claimed the Whitlocks practiced rituals in the dark, though no minister dared confront them directly. Others believed the family had made some pact, a bargain sealed during the war, an oath that ensured their survival at the price of those around them. It didn't matter that little evidence tied them to such talk. What mattered was what people believed. And yet, behind the walls, much of what unfolded wasn't myth but human cruelty. Silas, bitter and rigid, used the death of Elias as proof to his children, proof that power was all that mattered. "A man protects his own," he was heard to say, "and ain't no one has the right to strip what's ours." His voice, though rarely raised in public, thundered within the house, and those words carved into the minds of his children, shaping them more than school or church ever had. Martha Whitlock, once soft-spoken and devout, grew weaker under the weight of it. The deaths, the isolation, the silence, they pressed on her until she nearly stopped speaking altogether. Neighbors who recalled seeing her in earlier years remembered a faint smile when she traded eggs or cloth. After 1868, she spoke rarely, answered questions with nods, avoided the market entirely. Some swore they saw bruises beneath her sleeves, but no one dared press further. The farm itself reflected the darkness within. While other properties slowly recovered from the war years, adding fences, painting homes, sowing fresh hopes, the Whitlock land fell further into disrepair. Fences splintered, wagons rusted, and the livestock looked leaner each passing season. Yet the Whitlocks endured. They always endured. And that endurance unsettled people more than collapse ever could. The true terror for the town began not with what the Whitlocks did outwardly, but what seemed to emanate from their home inadvertently. Visitors, the rare few who ventured inside, often described a sensation of stifling heaviness. The air reeked faintly of smoke, though no fire burned. Walls seemed to echo strangely, as though voices lingered longer than they should. At night, travelers swore they saw figures in the upstairs windows, standing without moving, silhouettes against candlelight. And then came the sickness. In the autumn following Elias's death, fever swept through Drew County. Many families lost someone, as sickness paid no mind to grief or wealth. But within the Whitlock farm, the fever raged more violently than anywhere else. 2 of the children nearly died. Neighbors offered help, food, remedies, all refused by Silas. He trusted no one, and with each passing week, the family became more isolated, fenced in not just by wood but by mistrust and paranoia. When the fever finally subsided, leaving the Whitlocks alive but frailer, gossip spread like fire. Why had none of them died when so many others had? How was it possible that even the weakest of their brood survived when entire households elsewhere had been emptied? The word whispered on every lip was unnatural. There was no other explanation people could cling to. By winter, Drew County had informal boundaries, places one did not go after dark, and names one did not speak too loudly. The Whitlocks sat at the center of both. And yet, beneath the whispers, there lay a truth far plainer, far darker than superstition itself. The Whitlock clan was not cursed by spirits or protected by bargains. They were a family bound by fear, ruled by a patriarch who demanded silence and created brutality. Their horror was human-made, stitched into the fabric of each day, into every child who grew under their roof. But for those outside, unable to peer into the home, the mystery only grew. And in early 1869, when a second neighbor vanished near their property, the pattern of horror began its spiral once more. The story of the Whitlock clan was no longer about a single bloody night. It was about a lineage forming its reputation one shadow at a time, each act locking them more tightly into a legacy of dread. And with each disappearance, each whisper, each silence that stretched too long, the Whitlocks carved their place in Arkansas history as more than a family. They became a warning. The ground had already been seeded with fear. What followed over the next decade would water it with blood. The winter of 1869 was harsher than most. Freezing rains turned Arkansas roads into rivers of mud, isolating farms and leaving families to fend for themselves. In Drew County, the Whitlock homestead stood enveloped by mist, as if even the air refused to touch its walls. It was during this season that the clan's dark reputation deepened, through the vanishing of a man whose fate would forever be tied to their name. His name was Samuel Carter, a woodcutter from a neighboring farm, known by many for his modest, quiet ways. Carter had no history of quarrels, no debts, and no reason to risk conflict with anyone. least of all with the Whitlocks. Yet one evening, he walked toward their homestead carrying his axe and a bundle of kindling, and was never seen alive again. The story is told in fragments. Some say he went to sell firewood to Silas. Others believe he followed a set of wagon tracks that led toward their farm. But the truth remains unclear. What is certain is that 3 days after his disappearance, his blood-stained axe head was found near the swampy edges of Whitlock land, wedged in the roots of an old cypress. His body, however, was never recovered. The uproar in town was immediate. Unlike Elias Tully, whose hot temper gave people reason to imagine violence had found him, Samuel Carter had been gentle, respected. His absence left a hole far wider than his modest life would suggest. Whispers erupted into accusations. The Whitlocks had killed again. Sheriff Harlan Briggs rode out to investigate. Briggs was a man tired of war, tired of arguments, tired of the endless hunger and grief of the Reconstruction years. He wanted no part in feuds, but duty demanded he knock at the Whitlock door. When Silas opened it, the sheriff found himself staring into the eyes of a man who gave nothing away. Silas offered no warmth, no hostility either, just an emptiness that unsettled the lawman more than any outward aggression. Inside, Martha sat silent at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The children watched from the shadows, their faces still expressionless as if rehearsed. Briggs asked questions. He received little more than curt shakes of the head, dry denials. No one had seen Samuel Carter. No one knew why his axe might appear in the cypress roots. The sheriff pressed harder, searching the property against Silas's protests. Yet he found nothing. No body, no blood, no trace of violence within the house. Exhausted, irritated, and with little more than the townsfolk's suspicions to hold on to, Briggs rode back empty-handed. But the town did not forget. So in fact it was this absence, this gap between truth and evidence, that made the legend of the Whitlocks grow darker still. Families began saying aloud what they had only whispered before, that anyone who crossed the Whitlock farm risked vanishing into the swamps, swallowed by secrets too vast for justice to touch. Meanwhile, inside the Whitlock home, cracks deepened. Samuel Carter's disappearance carved silence into Martha more deeply than ever before. She knew what her children had seen, though they would never confess it aloud. The boys avoided her eyes, holding their own truths close. Mary, the eldest daughter, startled at the sound of her father's boots on the floorboards, though her own lips never spoke against him. Ruth, the youngest, began to cry less, not because she felt at peace, but because tears had become useless. Silas, however, thrived under the storm. He treated growing suspicion as proof of his strength. He told his sons this was how men endured, feared by others, unbent by guilt. To him, Samuel Carter's disappearance was not tragedy. It was affirmation. And to a family whose future depended only on his interpretation of survival, that affirmation tightened its grip. The town, meanwhile, shifted further away. Churches began instructing their congregations to avoid Whitlock dealings altogether. Some families went as far as moving westward, saying they refused to raise children anywhere near that cursed farm. By 1870, the Whitlocks' isolation was nearly complete. But isolation brought no peace. Instead, it intensified something inside their home, something no outsider could understand. The children began to reflect the paranoia of their father. Thomas often spoke of outsiders with contempt. He had watched the law stop at their threshold and retreat, unable or unwilling to touch them. To him, it made sense that the Whitlocks were superior in some nameless way. He began patrolling the property at night, rifle in hand, no longer a boy but a guard to his father's unspoken kingdom. James withdrew into his scribbles and sketches. The notebook swelled with drawings of twisted trees, of barns aflame, of strange figures standing in the swamp mist. He rarely explained them, but when Martha glimpsed the pages, her heart sank. These were not the drawings of a boy, but of someone already hardened by shadows. The sisters grew stiller by the year. Mary absorbed her father's silence, while Ruth's young face turned into a porcelain mask of watchfulness, learning far too early that survival in her home meant concealing every vulnerability. Then late that spring, farmers traveling along a back road claimed they heard screams carrying through the cypress groves near Whitlock territory. They followed cautiously, but found nothing except broken ground and the echo of silence. No one was reported missing that night, but the talk of it spread. cementing the belief that the Whitlocks were still at the heart of every whisper, every shadow that unsettled the county. By then, Drew County had stopped wondering if the Whitlocks were guilty. The question had shifted. It was no longer did they kill, but how many more would vanish before someone stopped them. But stopping the Whitlocks was easier spoken than done. They were protected, not by law or wealth, but by fear. The town hesitated to move against them, afraid of what seeking justice might awaken, and thus the second disappearance sealed their legacy. First Elias Tully, then Samuel Carter, and beyond them countless smaller tales of livestock lost, travelers unsettled, screams without explanation. The Whitlocks had become more than a family. They had become a story told in whispers, a caution not to test the dark edges of Arkansas land. And yet, inside the weathered house, the story was only beginning. By the early 1870s, the Whitlocks were no longer seen simply as neighbors. They had become a shadow cast across Drew County, a reminder of something people could neither fight nor understand. The farm stood half-worn, its fences leaning and its crops thin. Yet the family survived somehow, as though hardship could not kill them. What vanished instead were those who crossed too close. The disappearance of Samuel Carter remained unsolved, but it hardened the county's perception. Parents scolded children with a single warning: don't wander near the Whitlocks. Farmers swore they saw strange fires on the horizon at night, faint glows rising from the property, dying out before dawn. At every gathering, from churches to markets, the same words circled: they are cursed, and they will bring ruin upon us all. But what lived inside the Whitlock home was not curse nor magic. It was the weight of blood, carried from father to son, from silence to silence, binding them in ways no one beyond the walls could truly see. Silas Whitlock had grown colder. He looked older than his years, his face carved by war, labor, and bitterness. He ruled the household not with love, but with fear sharpened into scripture. Outsiders were enemies, weakness meant death, loyalty was not a choice but law. This creed had no compassion, but it carved the children into vessels of his own survival. Thomas, the eldest, was nearly a man, strong, sharp-eyed, with a voice quick to mimic his father's authority. He walked the edge of the farm at night, shotgun in hand, daring anyone to approach. Neighbors said they heard his footsteps pacing along the fence line past midnight, a rhythm of watchfulness that never seemed to sleep. James, more withdrawn, carried his father's lessons differently. His drawings filled with darker visions: men drowning in swamps, faces half erased, barns collapsing in flame. He had no words for the unease boiling inside him, so it spilled into images. Martha found his notebook hidden once beneath the floorboards. On one page, she saw the outline of a man hanging from a tree, faceless but unmistakable. She closed the book and whispered no word of it to anyone. The daughters, Mary and Ruth, were bound in quiet endurance. Mary grew sharp and wary, bordering on cruel when tested. By 15, she had learned to watch her father closely, to predict the sudden lurch of his temper before it struck. She carried the kind of silence that could turn into cutting words. Ruth, still the youngest, absorbed it all like a reflection. Her eyes followed the shadows in the home as if memorizing them. Those who saw her swore she never smiled. Martha, caught at the center, prayed endlessly for escape. Yet she also knew what every mother knows in silence. She was bound by blood to the children, however dark their fate. Her voice, once soft with hymns, had frayed to little more than murmurs. At night, in a whisper she hoped the children could not hear. She pleaded not for herself, but that her children might escape the weight pressing down on their name. The turning point came in 1871, the summer when blood once again stained their land. The story goes that two travelers, men chasing work after the war, drifting northward along broken roads, were last seen near the Whitlock property. They were strangers, with no quarrel and no history in Drew County. Their only mistake was seeking shelter along the road as night fell. By morning, their campsite was found abandoned, bedrolls pulled apart, no trace of where they'd gone. People searched for days. No bodies appeared, but a discovery was made, a trail of horse tracks leading toward Whitlock soil, cut deep into the mud as if dragging weight. Silas offered no explanation, denying he'd seen any such travelers, yet the whispers sharpened. The Whitlocks were no longer just dangerous. They had become predators, The rumor settled like frost over the county. Farmers began reporting livestock vanishing without cause. A cow tethered at dusk, gone by dawn. Only a broken rope left behind. Chickens torn apart in coops. In ordinary times, this might have been blamed on wolves or thieves. But nothing in Drew County was ordinary where the Whitlocks were concerned. Every loss was laid at their doorstep, whether truth or not. The sheriff once again tried to intervene, but the law had no anchor without bodies or confessions. Fear protected the Whitlocks more effectively than any jury verdict ever could. By the time the investigation ended, the town knew 2 more men were missing, and no justice would come. Inside the household, Silas hardened. He told his children this was proof of what he had always preached. "The world wants us gone," he said, "but we aren't going anywhere." It wasn't just instruction, it was prophecy. He was forging them in violence, testing their loyalty through silence, binding the family in secrecy so complete it erased any possibility of normal life. The youngest children absorbed this not as teaching, but as truth. Ruth no longer flinched at silence. James sketched darker visions still. Mary mirrored her father's manner when pressed, her authority sharp when she spoke. Thomas had become restless, eager almost, as though carrying his father's war for him. By then even Martha had ceased believing she could walk away. It was not just fear of her husband. It was fear of what the children had already become. Leaving would mean leaving them behind, abandoning them to the darkness without even her quiet presence as a tether. So she stayed. As the 1870s wore on, the Whitlock name no longer evoked pity for misfortune. It evoked cold dread. Strangers moving through Arkansas were warned to stay far from Drew County. In towns 2, 3 counties away, saloons repeated their story. The farm became legend, a scar on the land people preferred not to touch. But for those who lived nearby, it was no legend. It was real. They knew where the Whitlocks lived. They saw the windows glowing faintly in the swamp-dark nights. They heard Thomas's footsteps pacing, heard rumors of screams that carried over water, and by the end of that decade, the Whitlocks were no longer merely feared. They were hated. Hatred, though, can be dangerous. It festers in silence until someone dares to act. And it was precisely that hatred, in the dying years of the Reconstruction era, that would force a confrontation between the Whitlock clan and the county that feared them. By 1873, Drew County was split in 2 worlds, the one lived by ordinary families, and the shadow inhabited by the Whitlocks. The name had grown into a presence, cold and unyielding, as if their farm's rotten boards and sagging roof carried more weight than any church steeple or courthouse wall. People spoke less of them directly, but always with their memory circling, hanging over every story of loss, misfortune, or disappearance. But resentment, no matter how heavily buried, always finds its way to the surface. And in this case, it came not from strangers nor travelers, but from the neighbors who had lived closest to the Whitlocks for years. The Carrows and the Bowmans, families long settled in Drew County, had grown used to keeping their distance. Yet by the early 1870s, silence was no longer a shield. Their livestock was thinning, their children frightened by shadows in the woods or the echo of shots in the night. For them, the dread turned into anger. The tipping point was a single boy. Peter Bowman, 12 years old, failed to return home one evening after fishing along the edge of the cypress swamp. His horse returned alone, reins dragging in the mud. Men searched for 2 days, sweeping through the bog and brush, but Peter was gone. No body, no sign, no clue beyond the simple fact that the last rider who had seen him swore he was heading toward the Whitlock line. The Bowman family's grief cracked into fury. For them there was no mystery, no curse, no question. The Whitlocks had taken him, just as they had taken others. At the next church gathering, William Bowman stood and declared as much to the congregation. His voice edged with desperation and wrath. He named the Whitlocks as murderers. He vowed never to rest until his boy's absence was answered. Around him murmurs rose, some in agreement, some cautioning silence. But the tide was shifting. The county was beginning to feel the weight of its own fear. For years, people had whispered without action. Elias Tully, Samuel Carter, the nameless travelers, disappearing livestock, and now a boy. If silence dragged on longer, fear itself would become shame. Even those who dreaded the Whitlocks began to admit the truth. They could not live forever at the mercy of one family's shadow. Word of Bowman's accusations reached the Whitlock farm soon enough. Silas, unbothered, answered as he always had, with denial. Yet to his children, especially Thomas, the accusation burned like fire. Thomas had grown into manhood under his father's gaze, shaped by his creed of mistrust and endurance. For him, this attack was not just insult but war. One evening, as cicadas sang under the Arkansas heat, Thomas paced the worn boards of the porch, rifle resting in his arms. His words were sharp enough for Martha to hear from inside, though he did not direct them at her. "They think they can take us down. They think we'll bow." "No, Whitlock bows." His voice cracked with a certainty unlike his father's grave silence. It was anger, youthful, untamed, ready to spill. Martha said nothing. She sat at the kitchen table, hand pressed against her mouth as if to keep prayers from escaping. She knew the rhythm too well. Silence, rumor, accusation, and then blood. Always blood. It was never the family that bent toward peace. It was always the county that suffered. The tension swelled in Drew County like a storm heavy against the sky. Neighbors grew bolder with whispers, daring to talk in groups instead of behind closed doors. Meetings were held quietly in barns, the kind where men brought lanterns and closed doors against sound. They spoke of justice, of defending their families, of ending the terror that no sheriff dared confront. Some urged caution. Others, like William Bowman, pushed for revenge. Yet the Whitlock's frightful reputation haunted every conversation. How does one move against a family believed to hold death in their blood? Men hardened from war still spoke of the Whitlocks with unease, as though striking them might bring ruin on their own kin. But the hunger for justice or vengeance was stronger still. It was one of those nights, rain drumming heavy against the ground, that a single plan began to form: to ride to the Whitlock property, confront Silas, and demand answers. Word of this reached the Whitlock children long before the men gathered the courage to act. Ruth, the youngest, overheard it on a market trip, whispers traded too freely by women who thought she was too small to listen. When she told Martha, the mother's face blanched. She knew what such confrontation meant. She had seen it already with Elias, with Carter, with the others. Nothing ever ended with truth. It ended with graves. When she told Silas, his response was predictable. A stony nod, a murmur of defiance. He viewed it not as danger, but as validation. "They fear us," he said. "And when men fear, they try to strike. Let 'em come." Inside the Whitlock home, preparation began. Guns were cleaned, shells counted, boards reinforced. Thomas took command of nightly patrols, his figure visible to those who dared pass within sight of the property. The daughters stayed mostly inside, silence draped around them like another layer of dust. James sketched furiously by candlelight, as if etching the storm before it arrived, and Martha prayed. Always prayed. But even her prayers had grown brittle with time, cracked under the knowledge that no words could erase what was coming. The clash was inevitable. For the Whitlocks it was survival, pride, blood. For the county it was justice, vengeance, release. And between them there could be no peace. The stage was set not by choice but by years of silence, whispers, disappearances, and fear too long endured. By 1873, Drew County knew in its bones the Whitlocks would not go quietly, and those who stood against them would have to meet them not with law, but with fire. The first spark was closer than anyone realized. The summer of 1873 bled hot into Drew County. The soil cracked under the unforgiving sun, cicadas screamed unendingly through heavy days, and in the swamps air hung so thick a man felt it choke when he breathed. But it was not heat that weighed most heavily on the county's hearts. It was the certainty that a reckoning was coming. Whispers had grown into plans and plans into action. For weeks men met in barns and backrooms, carrying the kind of fear that drives itself into anger. Farmers, preachers, and war-hardened veterans gathered beneath lantern glow, each man clutching his convictions tight. At the center of it all stood William Bowman, father of the lost boy, unwilling to let his child disappear into silence like the others before. To him, no curse explained Drew County's grief. No superstition excused it. The Whitlocks were to blame, and if law would not act, then men must. The plan was simple in thought, though heavy in consequence. Ride to the Whitlock place by night. Confront Silas and tear the truth from him. They called themselves nothing. They had no banners, no grand speeches. They were fathers, brothers, neighbors, united not by justice perhaps, but by desperation. In the Whitlock home the air had turned sharp. Silas knew they would come. He had seen the shift in the county long before rumors reached his door. And to a man who believed survival was certainty, he was not shaken but stiffened in resolve. For days he prepared. His sons shouldered rifles, Thomas leading with fierce determination, James quieter but watchful, ready. The daughters, Mary and Ruth, were kept close, their silent eyes absorbing every preparation. Martha sat with prayers pressed against her lips, though deep down she began to wonder. Perhaps the collision would bring an end one way or another, to the cycle stretching like a noose around their family. The night came with no moonlight. Clouds smothered the stars, leaving the land cloaked in darkness deeper than even the pines could provide. Insects buzzed loud, broken only by the distant sound of hooves. Slowly up the dirt path, figures emerged, horses carrying men with lanterns low, rifles strapped across their shoulders. 15 in all, every face set with grim resolve. The Whitlocks had been waiting. From the porch, Thomas watched first, rifle barrel gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Silas stepped out beside him, broad, unyielding, a man who wore the air of warlike armor. Behind them, in the grim shadows of the doorway, stood Martha and the children, silent observers of history taking root. The riders halted at the fence line, their lanterns swaying, breath of horses clouding in the heavy dark. For a moment, silence stretched between them, long and heavy, as if the land itself waited for the first word. William Bowman was the one to break it. His voice carried raw, ragged fury. "Silas Whitlock, you got my boy's blood on your hands. You and your brood been a plague on this county long enough. We come tonight for answers." The accusation hung in the air like thunder. The other men shifted, gripping rifles tighter, waiting. Some smelled of whiskey, nerves burning through their anger. Silas, calm as ever, stepped one pace forward. His voice was low but clear enough to cut the night. "Your boy wandered into the swamp. Weakness took him, not me. You'll not hang his death on my door." The word struck Bowman like a blow. He raised his rifle, trembling fury pulling at his hands. "You lying dog. Every soul knows it's you. Every man here knows it." For a heartbeat, silence again. A silence taut as wire, ready to snap. And then Thomas spoke. His young voice sharp, biting without hesitation. "Step on this land, and you'll not leave it." The challenge rang loud enough that even horses snorted and pawed the dirt. The riders stirred. Some glanced at one another, uncertain, yet Bowman's grief propelled them forward. He shouted, "Then so be it." The first shot shattered the night. No one remembers who pulled the trigger, whether Whitlock rifle or rider's desperation, but once fired, there was no return. Gunfire echoed like thunder across the fields. Lanterns swung wild, shadows broke into chaos. The Whitlocks fired from the porch, rifles cracking in controlled fury. Bullets tore through the dark, striking wood, splitting air. The riders returned fire blindly, their horses panicking under the noise and flashes. Men shouted, cursed, some fell. Others pressed forward toward the house. Thomas fought like his father's shadow, relentless, eyes ablaze, pulling trigger after trigger, as if daring death to touch him. James, though quieter, coldly took his place at the window, firing with calm precision. Mary and Ruth watched from behind, their silence unbroken, even as screams rose outside. Martha huddled, not praying this time, but clutching her youngest, desperate as the house shook under fire. Her tears burned, though not from fear alone, but from knowing nothing now could break the cycle. This was the fate sealed years ago, now spilling open for all to see. The battle raged not long, yet it stretched eternal in memory. Hooves thundered retreat, rifles cracked, men staggered into swamps, some never to rise again. When the smoke thinned and silence crept back, the riders were gone, those still breathing pulling away into the night, leaving bodies in the dirt behind them. On the Whitlock side, wounds were carried but no dead. Silas stood tall, Thomas unbroken, James unflinching. For them, survival that night was not victory. It was proof that they were untouchable, beyond law, beyond county, perhaps even beyond fate. But for Drew County, fear transformed into something else. The night riders had tried to bring an end, and instead they had spilled blood without justice. Families buried men with no boys returned home. Mothers wept at church steps. Widows cursed the name harder than ever. And through it all, one certainty hardened like iron. The Whitlocks had won. Yet victory carries its own curse. After that night, the county's hatred turned from whispers to a wound that would not heal. The Whitlocks were marked not as cursed anymore, but as killers. Untouchable, yes, but not invincible, and the people swore deep in their grief. There would come another reckoning, stronger, harsher, impossible to escape. Inside the Whitlock home that night, silence followed long after the guns quieted. Martha sat trembling, staring at the blood on the porch steps, listening to her children breathe in ragged triumph. She thought of prayers whispered across years, and for the first time understood that God had left this house long ago. The Whitlock clan, bound by survival, had drawn first blood openly, and the county would not forget it. What had begun in whispers would now grow into war. The morning after the gunfire, the soil of Drew County carried silence heavier than any sermon bell. Along the road, smoke still clung to the air. Birds avoided the usual trees, as if nature itself recoiled from what had passed. Horses had scattered, wagons sat abandoned, and men lay beneath blankets hurriedly stretched in barns, their blood seeping into wood and hay. For every rider who had left home the night before, only some returned. Families gathered in mourning, heads bowed not just for the dead, but for the failure. They had tried to end the Whitlocks, but instead the clan had endured, standing taller, darker, stronger than before. It was not merely a defeat. It was humiliation. William Bowman buried his son Peter without a body to place in the ground. Then he buried a brother, slain in the firefight. For him, grief turned to stone, cold and immovable. He no longer raged at the Whitlocks in public. Instead, his voice fell into low whispers, sharp as steel, muttering promises only vengeance could keep. Others in the county shared his torment. Some wagged their heads and claimed the Whitlocks truly were protected, not by law, not by skill, but by something more terrible. Others cursed themselves for even daring to try. A few men drifted from the county entirely, unable to live in the shadow of the failure. But retreating did not erase the memory. Stories spread rapidly across Arkansas. What happened in Drew County became the talk of towns dozens of miles away. Neighbors riding against a cursed family, braving guns in the night, only to fall under their fire. Each retelling painted the Whitlocks as darker figures still, transforming them from dangerous farmers into near-mythical monsters. Few cared whether the stories grew distorted. To the people, truth mattered less than fear, and the Whitlocks thrived on both. Inside the Whitlock home, the family bore their survival not as miracle, but as law. Silas considered the riders proof of what he had taught his children. The world outside wanted them dead, and so the world could never be trusted. His voice thundered sermons of their own kind, lessons teaching loyalty to blood before all else. The incident was no accident, he repeated, no curse of rumor. It was envy, hatred, weakness from others who could not endure. And the Whitlocks, standing alive amid burning soil, would endure still. Thomas carried those words like a banner. He strutted through the farm with a sharpened pride, as though the shadows themselves bowed to him. Neighbors who saw him riding alone swore that defiance burned clear in his eyes, daring anyone to meet it. To him, the firefight was not tragedy, but initiation. He had proved what he already knew, that Whitlocks bowed to none. James, quieter though he was, absorbed the night in other ways. His drawings now filled with fire and smoke, rifles firing in jagged lines, faceless men falling beneath trees. He no longer sketched animals or barns. Only death, blood, and the faces of his family, drawn broader, darker, as if etching them into permanence. The daughters sank deeper into silence. Mary sharpened into steel, staying longer inside, her tone clipped and cutting when forced to speak. Ruth, still the youngest, seemed not a child at all anymore. When others her age played with wooden dolls or whispered childish superstitions, she merely stared, watchful, patient, her silence so sharp it unsettled those who glimpsed it. Martha perhaps bore the wound most heavily. Though her family had survived unscathed in body, her spirit broke further. She prayed still, late into nights when the house creaked around her. But those prayers felt like whispers dropped into an abyss, unheard, unanswered. Each gunshot from the firefight echoed endlessly in her memory. Each fallen man haunted her, not as enemy but as proof of ruin. She had once believed her family cursed. Now she believed something worse. They weren't cursed by outside forces. They were the curse. In the county, fear transformed into something quieter, crueler, and hard to measure. Resentment that clawed not openly, but beneath the skin of every home. Men looked at their rifles differently, wondering why theirs had failed while Whitlock rifles struck true. Mothers drew children closer when walking past fences, as though shadows reached beyond wood and into road. At night, candles burned longer, families whispering fearful stories they once tried to stifle. And then the disappearances began again. That fall, a hunter named Josiah Clark failed to return from the woods. His hounds came back alone, whining and bloody at the paws. Men searched for days but found no trace. Most whispered what they truly believed: the Whitlocks had taken him. None dared voice it openly, not again so soon after the failed raid. Months later, tracks of a wagon were discovered near the swamp, leading nowhere. Locals swore a family traveling from Louisiana had vanished on that same route. Nothing was ever recovered but a child's toy soaked in mud. And once again, suspicion circled the Whitlock house without ever daring to breach it. The spiral was clear. For the Whitlocks, silence was protection. For the county, silence was prison. Terror had cemented into the soil, invisible, undeniable, unbreakable. The 1870s marched on, year by year, with every season carrying new whispers. The Whitlocks still worked their farm, still walked their land as though nothing had changed. And in truth, nothing had, because nothing could. The law of blood was stronger now than ever. The Whitlocks killed, or they were accused of killing. They survived. They endured. The county carried grief. And so it continued year after year, until silence itself became part of the legend. Deaths without confession, wounds without healing, whispers without end. But legends, however dark, cannot confine men forever. Drew County held fathers who buried their sons and mothers who wept for vanished kin. By 1875, 8 years after Elias Tully's blood first spilled by their fence, voices again began to rise, not loud yet, but enough to carry. The Whitlocks had silenced the county once. But blood breeds memory, and memory breeds wrath. And the longer hatred ferments, the sharper it cuts when it returns. Martha sensed it before the others. Each night, when wind rattled through pine or when dogs barked at distant silhouettes, she flinched as though the reckoning were walking nearer. Silas called her fears weakness. Thomas laughed at the idea that anyone would dare again. But Martha knew in her bones survivors do not escape. They only wait. And the waiting for the Whitlock clan was far from over. By 1876, Drew County existed in 2 states at once: open, under the unrelenting Arkansas sun, where crops grew and life carried its rhythms, and closed under the whispering shadow of the Whitlocks, where fear seeded itself deeper each year. The county was fractured, torn between those who longed for justice and those who insisted silence was the only way to survive. The failed raid of 1873 had left scars still visible. Too many men lay in graves, their widows glaring across pews at the families who urged the attack. Too many fathers had left, chasing land elsewhere rather than raising their children beside the Whitlock farm. The defeat had frightened some into submission, made cautious by blood. But for others, grief had hardened into resolution. William Bowman embodied that resolution. With the loss of his boy Peter unsolved, and another grave freshly dug for his brother, he nurtured his hatred into a cause. He no longer raised his voice in public sermons of anger. Instead, he worked quietly, spreading whispers of vengeance the way Silas Whitlock had spread silence in his home. Bowman's voice was measured now, convincing, persuasive. He told fathers their children would never truly be safe, while the Whitlocks drew breath. He told farmers their livestock would vanish, their homes quake under curse so long as Whitlock rifles remained primed. Others listened. Not all, but enough. The county edge shifted again, slow, dangerous, like the tilt of a storm against the horizon. Meanwhile, the Whitlocks lived as they always had. They tended their land. Though crops grew poorer, fences fell further into ruin. The household seemed suspended in its own gravity, time bending strangely inside its rotting walls. Silas grew sterner with every year, his words carrying an iron weight, though his body showed signs of wear, stooped shoulders, cracked voice, illness gnawing at the edges of his strength. But his rule never softened. To him, sickness was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. Thomas filled the growing gaps. Now a man, broad-shouldered, fearless, he walked the property as if it were his kingdom, daring any neighbor even to glance across in defiance. His reputation spread wider than his father's by then. People spoke his name with the same hushed dread, calling him not simply Silas's son, but the heir of whatever darkness gripped the Whitlocks. James remained different. He was grown, yes, but his silence was heavier, withdrawn to the point of estrangement. He rarely spoke to anyone but Martha, who tried in her fractured way to keep some tether to his heart. His drawings, by then, had transformed from childish sketches to disturbing etchings of remarkable detail, depictions of fire-consuming faceless figures, rifles blasting against the night, swamps swallowing men whole. Rumors spread that he filled entire journals with these images. Neighbors swore that if one glimpsed James by lantern light, his eyes looked as though he had been watching horrors long before they arrived. Mary grew harder, sharper. Her voice could cut like her father's now, and she wielded silence as a weapon. Ruth, though still the youngest, was far from a child. Her eyes, wide and hollow, reflected a kind of anticipation, as if she was waiting, knowing well that something inevitable approached. In town, conversations turned sharper. Some pushed for law, demanding the sheriff or courts intervene. But the sheriff, still Sheriff Briggs, had grown older, weary, uninterested in losing more men in the pursuit of justice that evidence would never support. He warned again what had been proven 3 years before. Confronting the Whitlocks meant blood. Without bodies, without proof beyond whispers, the law had no teeth sharp enough, so men turned away from law and back to themselves. Bowman's whispers grew into quiet plans once more. This time, no sudden raid, no reckless night of drunken fury. This time, careful steps. Count men, count rifles, prepare with patience. If the Whitlocks were to be ended, it would be by overwhelming force. Meanwhile, Drew County spiraled further. Disappearances continued. Travelers lost on roads hunters never found. Some whispered the Whitlocks were the cause. Others merely feared it. It no longer mattered if the truth could be proven. Perception alone was enough. The Whitlocks had become the county's curse, whether fair or not, a name spoken in dark tone whenever misfortune fell. Martha knew it too. She sensed the county creeping closer with every passing year, the weight of vengeance pressing against her home. Each night when the cicadas screamed and the swamp wind shook the shutters, she waited for the sound of hooves, for distant lanterns swinging through the trees. Silas brushed off her fear as weakness. Thomas mocked it, but Martha knew. The reckoning did not die in 1873. It had only been postponed, and she feared, more than any outsider, what her children had already become by the time that reckoning returned. One evening, a visitor came, as the first in months, a preacher named Matthew Collins, young, freshly assigned to the county. Against all warnings, he rode to the Whitlock farm, claiming he wished only to offer prayer, to remind them that no family was beyond the reach of God's mercy. He never returned. His horse was found days later, wandering without rider. The preacher's Bible was discovered near the swamp's edge, its pages torn, mud-soaked, unreadable. To Drew County, this was no accident. Not merely another disappearance. This was God's own servant taken into shadow. And to them that meant only one truth. The Whitlocks had crossed even higher boundaries now, after Reverend Collins' silence shattered. No longer whispers, no longer hesitation. Church sermons thundered about evil dwelling among men, and voices cracked with fury as they named the family aloud. Bowman moved with greater force, his cause embraced not as vengeance for his boy, but as salvation of the county itself. By late 1876, vigilante groups began to form openly. They did not hide in barns or whisper by lantern. They sharpened rifles in daylight, rode by daylight, and spoke aloud for all to hear. The county was no longer divided between fear and anger. The lines had drawn clear. War was coming not as rumor, but as inevitability, and the Whitlocks inside their rotting house prepared to meet it in silence, in blood. By 1877, Drew County no longer asked if the Whitlocks were guilty. That question had died years before. Every missing child, every lost hunter, every wagon discovered abandoned in the swamp had become another nail in the coffin of silence. Fathers no longer argued over what had to be done. They agreed. Mothers begged their husbands not to act, but grief carried louder voices than caution. And so it was decided. The Whitlocks would face their fate. This time it would not be a raid in secrecy. It would be war. Word spread slowly, woven into conversations over fences and whispered prayers at church gatherings. Families swore oaths to one another, promising to ride when the night came. Some men sharpened blades, others polished rifles, and still others filled bottles with kerosene. The plan was not just to confront, but to finish. Fire, shot, and certainty. For many, it was less about justice than cleansing, purging a name that had poisoned the county for nearly a decade. They told themselves it was God's will. They told themselves it was duty. But in truth, it was vengeance dressed as righteousness, weighted by years of fear. Inside the Whitlock home, the air carried thick tension, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. Silas, older now, wheezed with the sickness time had placed on him, but his eyes, cold and iron, lost nothing of their defiance. He saw in the county's stirrings not his doom, but his final war. "Let them come," he rasped. "We end it here." Thomas, now the true muscle of the family, carried himself like a general awaiting battle. He oiled his rifle, patrolled the edges of the farm, his jaw set in pride. Death was not something he feared. It was something he welcomed, a chance to carve immortality into the land. James stood apart. His drawings had grown darker, sharper, disturbingly precise. Silas seldom gave them notice, but Martha saw page after page depicting fire, men screaming. The Whitlock house engulfed. Whether prophecy or imagination, she could not say. But in his silence, James had already accepted what was coming. Mary had hardened into her father's likeness, her words sharp as steel, her gaze hollow with certainty. And Ruth, though still young, had lost every trace of childhood. She followed Mary's every move, her silence chilling even Martha, who no longer recognized the girl she had once rocked in her arms. Martha herself was a shadow, clinging to faith as though it frayed between her fingers. At night she prayed not for victory but for release from the silence, the blood, the unending cycle that had swallowed each year of her children's lives. The siege began on a night of storm. Thunder rolled low across the fields, and heavy clouds masked the moon entirely. Into that darkness rode more than 24 men, armed not only with rifles but with torches. Their boots struck the mud in rhythm, their lanterns swinging like omens. They descended on the Whitlock farm in silence, surrounding the crooked house. Only then did one voice break into the roar of storm: William Bowman. His words were not shouted in rage this time. They were steadier, quieter, sharpened by grief too deep for fury. Silas Whitlock. Enough blood has been spilled. Come out and face what you brought down on this land. Inside, the Whitlocks held their breath. For one heartbeat, even Silas seemed still. And then, slowly, the old patriarch rose to his feet, coughing through the sickness in his lungs, and walked to the doorway. His eyes burned against the torchlight outside, against the dozens of figures waiting. "You want the Whitlocks?" His voice cracked but carried, defiant as ever. "Then come take us." The first fire lit the porch. Kerosene soaked the boards, flames climbing quick into the night. Gunfire followed, splitting the storm. The siege had begun. The Whitlocks fought with the desperation of doomed creatures. Thomas surged like a storm through every window, rifle blazing, shouting challenges into the dark. James took his post with icy calm, his bullets finding targets as if he had drawn the battle years before. Mary loaded, reloaded, firing between shouts. Even young Ruth carried powder to her brothers, silent as a ghost feeding the fire. Martha clutched the Bible in her lap, praying as sparks rained down and the walls groaned with heat. For all the years she feared this reckoning, she knew within herself it was the only path that remained. The men outside pressed harder, shouting, firing, torches swinging high. The old house, worn by years of neglect, caught the flames too quickly. Smoke swelled thick into the storm air. Boards screamed as the heat consumed them. Still the Whitlocks fought. Each shot they fired claimed another life, sending groans into the mud. But each second also closed their fate tighter. The heat swelled, choking the rooms. Bullets tore holes in walls that danced with flame. The porch collapsed in sparks and splintered wood, and then Silas himself stepped forward, rifle in shaking hands, coughing through smoke to fire one final round into the dark before torchlight engulfed him. His body staggered back into the burning house that had carried his name for too long. The others fought longer, but there was no hope. The fire was too fierce, the wall of men outside too wide. The Whitlocks died within the blaze, swallowed by flame and ash. Whether every body was dragged from the ruin, or whether some were left to burn, history never told clearly. What was certain was this: By morning, nothing stood but embers, smoke, and silence. The county declared victory. But it was not joy that spread through Drew County. It was not relief nor peace. What filled the air was hollowness. Families buried their own yet again, not all of them Whitlocks. Dozens of lives were taken by that single night, consuming Whitlock blood and neighbor blood alike. The Whitlocks ended that night not simply as a family destroyed, but as a story cemented. For years after, travelers passing through Drew County were told of it, of the cursed clan consumed by fire, of the families who rode to end them. Parents warned children never to draw too close to the swamp, where ghosts of the Whitlocks were said to linger in smoke. Others whispered the Whitlocks had not all died, that one or two children had slipped into the dark, surviving beyond the flames to carry their blood elsewhere. In the ashes of that house, truth no longer mattered. Legend replaced fact, and the legend was darker than any family should ever bear. When the fire finally died, the Whitlock farm was nothing more than blackened timbers and smoke, curling into the Arkansas sky. The earth itself seemed scarred, scorched patches spreading like wounds across the soil. The county men, weary and bruised, stood among the embers with rifles still hot and throats raw from shouting. They had won, yes, but no one called it victory. The Whitlocks were gone. Their house, their legacy, their silence that had haunted Drew County for nearly a decade, all consumed by flame. And yet when dawn broke and the light spilled across the charred remains, something felt unfinished. Bodies were pulled from the wreckage, burned, twisted, difficult to tell one from the other. The patriarch Silas Whitlock collapsed near the fireplace. Thomas, found with a rifle clutched so tightly, his hands had to be pried away even in death. Mary and Ruth, their silhouettes crumpled together in the kitchen's corner. James, silent at last, discovered with his sketchbook charred into ash at his side. Martha sprawled near the threshold, as if reaching for the night air, as if praying still for an escape that never came. For Bowman and the others, this should have been closure. But what stared back at them from the smoldering ruin was not relief. It was horror. Horror of what they had become to end the Whitlocks. Horror of bodies scorched beyond mercy. Horror of children burned as loudly as any man. They called it justice, but deep inside, every man standing there understood the price. The county buried their dead, the riders lost in the siege, and the Whitlocks in graves unmarked, hastily dug at the edge of their ruined farm. Some said their bodies were cursed and refused to lie in churchyard soil. Others claimed the land itself absorbed them, too poisoned to carry wheat or cotton ever again. But the story did not die with the smoke. In the years that followed, Drew County carried the Whitlock name like a scar stitched into the land. Travelers passing through were told not to wander into the swamps. Children were warned to behave, or the Whitlocks would take you. Folks swore you could still hear footsteps pacing at night where Thomas once patrolled, rifles in hand. Others claimed to see a small girl's figure, Ruth perhaps, watching through the woods, silent and unblinking. No matter how much the people tried to bury the truth, the memory lingered. The Whitlocks had never been just a family. They had become a mirror, showing the county its own fear, its own violence, its own hunger for vengeance. The fire may have ended their bloodline, but the echo of their story survived, mutating into folklore, legend, and nightmare. By 1880, Drew County was quieter, the wounds of war and Whitlock alike settling into silence. Crops returned to the fields. Families rebuilt. Roads bore wagons once more. Yet the land where the Whitlock house once stood lay empty. Farmers refused to claim it, not even for free. The soil was said to be barren, choked by ash, cursed by blood. Grass grew in awkward patches, trees twisted at odd angles, the silence there heavier than anywhere around. Those who rode past swore they felt watched, as if the absence itself had eyes. Hooves quickened, eyes averted. No one set foot there willingly, and still rumors endured. Some whispered that Silas's voice could be heard in the winds, whispering survival's creed. A man protects his own. Others said James's drawings were found intact, hidden away in stables and barns, pages filled with depictions of fire and death long before the siege. No man admitted keeping them, but the county knew the sketches still existed, tucked away in shadows. Perhaps the darkest rumor of all was that not every Whitlock had died that night. That smoke and darkness gave cover for one to slip away, carrying their name beyond Drew County. Whether a son or daughter, no one agreed, but the possibility was enough. A whispered seed. Enough to keep the legend alive in every town the story reached, because the truth was never fully about what the Whitlocks did. It was about what people believed they did, and belief carves deeper than fact. The disturbing history of the Whitlock clan did not end in 1877. It continued wherever whispers traveled. In courthouse records scribbled in fading ink. In Bible margins marked with trembling hands. In taverns where old men muttered of the cursed family, swallowed by their own fire. In children's tales told beneath blankets, where shadows belonged to Whitlock still pacing in the night. The bloodline ended, perhaps. The house collapsed, certainly. But their story, once unleashed, had no grave. Drew County healed us, but never forgot. The name Whitlock carried weight long after the ash cooled, a name spoken low, an emblem of warning, a reminder of what silence, vengeance, and blood can build when left unchecked. For some, the Whitlocks were cursed. For others, evil. But for those who truly understood, the truth was worse. The Whitlocks had never needed curses. They were flesh and bone, failure and fear, cruelty and silence. They were human. And that was what made their story most terrifying of all. And so, long after the smoke cleared, long after the last Whitlock was gone from Drew County, a question remained behind. Were the Whitlocks monsters made by their blood? Or were they made by the very land? The neighbors and the silence of a county too afraid to act until fire was all that remained. No answer ever came. Only echoes. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.